When you think about businesses that are selling through the roof, like Aloe or Allbirds, sure, you think about a great product, a cool brand, and great marketing. But an often overlooked secret is actually the businesses behind the business, making selling, and for shoppers, buying, simple. For millions of businesses, that business is Shopify. Nobody does online business better than Shopify. It's home of Shop Pay, the #1 checkout in the world. You can use it to boost conversions up to 50%, meaning way less carts going abandoned and way more sales going through to checkout. Sign up for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/income, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/income to upgrade your selling today. That's shopify.com/income.
The Presidencies of the United States is a proud member of the Evergreen Podcast Network. On the surface, it seems like such a simple question. When did the Civil War end? We've all learned over the years that Lee's surrender at Appomattox on April 9, 1865, marks the end of the Civil War. My guest for this episode, however, makes some excellent points in his new book as to why we should reconsider that date and what we can learn by letting go of some misconceptions and exploring the ambiguities in the conclusion of the conflict between the states. Michael Vorenberg is the author of Final Freedom, The Civil War, The Abolition of Slavery, and the 13th Amendment, which was a finalist for the Gilder Lehrman Lincoln Prize and was used as the basis for the screenplay of Steven Spielberg's 2012 film, Lincoln. He is also the author of The Emancipation Proclamation, A Brief History with Documents, as well as a number of essays on legal and constitutional history. His writings have appeared in the Chicago Tribune, the New York Times, Politico, and the Washington Post. He teaches at Brown University in Providence, Rhode Island. His latest book is Lincoln's Peace, The Struggle to End the American Civil War. I cannot thank Mike enough for his time and the insight that he provided in our conversation. I'll have a link to the book on the page for this episode on my website, presidenciespodcast.com. Special thanks also to Alora Well of Penguin Random House for working to connect Mike and me for this interview. Without further ado, after this brief message, let's get to my discussion with Mike.
Your data is like gold to hackers. They're selling your passwords, bank details, and private messages. McAfee helps stop them. Secure VPN keeps your online activity private. AI-powered text scam detector spots phishing attempts instantly. And with award-winning antivirus, you get top-tier hacker protection. Plus, you'll get up to $2 million in identity theft coverage, all for just $39.99 for your first year. Visit McAfee.com. Cancel anytime. Terms apply.
Mike, thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you, and thank you for having me on. It's a wonderful podcast, and it's a pleasure to be here.
Absolutely. And it's a pleasure to be able to talk to you about your book. And your book is Lincoln's Peace, The Struggle to End the American Civil War. There is so much in this book, and I've got a ton of questions. We're not going to get to everything that you included in this book. And of course, I highly encourage our listeners to pick up your book. But just to get us started, in the prologue of your book, you share how the discovery of a report by Assistant Secretary of War Lewis Grant, who was no relation to General Grant, caused you to question the traditionally accepted date of April 9th, 1865 as the end of the Civil War. Would you mind sharing with us more about Grant's report and how it led you to write this book?
Yes, I'd like to share that story, and I do put it in the prologue of the book because it captures why I wrote the book, or that is the kernel of the idea for the book. The person who wrote the report, as you say, is Lewis Grant, and he was no relation to Ulysses Grant. He loved Ulysses Grant, he admired him, also admired William Tecumseh Sherman. He named one of his children Grant Tecumseh Sherman Grant were both in the kid's name. But let me go back. the context is really important. In 2003, while I was working on another book, I, like many Americans, witnessed on television or learned about this speech given by then President George W. Bush, in which he declared that combat operations in Iraq were over. So this was the context. Here's the U.S. invasion of Iraq. And he gave this speech, ironically, on the ship Abraham Lincoln. And behind him was a banner that said mission accomplished. And so many of us then knew it as the mission accomplished speech. And at the time, this is in May of 2003, at the time he came in for a lot of criticism. How can a president simply declare an end of war and somehow make the war go away? I do want to say that what he was doing was saying that the war was moving from a combat operation to occupation armies, but the point was to declare mission accomplished. So then that's the important context, because I happened to be in the archives just a couple weeks later. And effectively what happened is an archivist brought by mistake the wrong box for what I was looking for. And in this box, without getting too much into detail, was a tab labeled End of War. And that struck me as an interesting tab. So I pulled out this file in this box deep in the archives, and in it was this report by Lewis Grant. Lewis Grant had risen through the ranks and had been an officer of the U.S. troops, and it was at Appomattox on April 9th, 1865, when Robert E. Lee surrendered to Ulysses Grant. That's the key. So April 9, 1865 is the date for us to hold in our head, and the date that many people do hold in our head as the end of the Civil War. And because of that really important surrender, the image of that surrender is everywhere, and you don't even necessarily notice it. It's in high school history textbooks. If you've seen the film Lincoln by Steven Spielberg, toward the end of the film, there's a piece of the film in which the surrender is pictured, despite the fact that Lincoln was not there. So it's obviously an important moment in American history. And in this report, Lewis Grant, who at that time was an assistant secretary of the war, and he had been at Appomattox, but now we're dealing with the 1890s, many years after, and he had been asked to find the official end date of the Civil War. And the reason was relatively trivial. Basically, someone had applied for a Civil War pension, and oddly enough, this person hadn't joined the Army until early 1866, that is nearly a year after Appomattox. Lewis Grant's first reaction was, well, this is crazy. This is because the war obviously ended at Appomattox. He should know, he was there. But then he started doing research, and all of this is in this report that I'm reading. And the research led him to the conclusion that he then writes up in a memo and a report that the official end date of the war is August 20th, 1866. And on that date, President Andrew Johnson had issued a proclamation saying that there was an end of the Civil War. There are specific reasons, political reasons, why Johnson gave that proclamation that we may return to later in this conversation. As a Civil War historian, I knew vaguely about that proclamation because I study Civil War and Reconstruction. I teach about it, but I never had thought much of it as anything other than just a sort of political episode. It turns out that that was, legally speaking, the end of the Civil War. It had been affirmed as such by the U.S. Supreme Court. And I'm not saying it's the true end of the Civil War, not at all. The book is about how there really are many endings and non-endings of the Civil War. But now I return to the context, which was that President Bush had just given this speech. And I thought, oh, here's another president declaring an end of the war, effectively trying to make a war go away by means of presidential proclamation. And it worked in a sense that it became legal. And now I'll just wrap this up by saying later on, I would learn that there's at least one major international relations data project which collects data on wars, beginning dates, end dates, number of casualties, that kind of thing. And this is a major data set, and it recorded the end of the U.S.-Iraqi war that began in 2003, the invasion as May 1st, 2003, which was the date of Bush's speech. In other words, that it was possible to conceive of an actual end date represented by Bush's speech. So the kernel of this idea of a president being able to simply declare a war over and that actually having traction was fascinating to me. I didn't think about it. I thought about it all the time, but I decided not to write about it. I kept on working on this book, but then it kept on coming up because after President Bush came President Obama, and he did the same thing. Much less publicity, but there was a flag lowering ceremony in Iraq to mark the end of the war. And so I, again, was struck by this way in which presidents have this role that they often play to end a war through some kind of proclamation or a ritual or both. That's a long answer to your question, but I hope it sets up how I came to write the book, why the book struck me, why the topic of the end of the Civil War struck me as relevant at the time. I still think it's quite relevant to this time as well, where we're in now.
Definitely. And one of the things that I really enjoyed about reading your book is that you really highlight there's a thread through your entire book of the nuances of the human experience, of when you're dealing with people, you have different perspectives, you have different viewpoints, you have different agendas, and that really runs through and it shows this. It seems like it's such a simple question, but it's not, because there was so much more to the story than just, okay, we had Appomattox, the war's over. And exploring that and exploring what happens in the lead up to and then post Appomattox, it doesn't just go away, even though we try and make things so neat and tidy in history.
Exactly. And the way you've put it is superb. I don't mean to fault anyone who wants to hold on to Appomattox as an end date. I myself did so, and I probably will continue to do so just by habit in teaching and for simplicity's sake. So I will use terms like post-Appomattox or after Appomattox as a way to signal after the Civil War. I am not trying to contend that Appomattox is the wrong end date and that it should be replaced in all the textbooks and such with a new end date. I think Appomattox is a truly important event, and I could go on about why it is. And it did mark at the time, to many, as an end, or the end even. So I just want to say that first. But now if we step back and really take the larger view and think about the larger question, how to end a war. That's the question which was on many people's minds. I would say, actually, from the moment of the war's beginning, the question of how does this war end? What has to happen for this war to be said to be over, right? That's going on. And so really the way I begin is by coming at this by saying, well, let's focus on Abraham Lincoln. And what did he think had to happen for the end of the war to happen? So Lincoln leaves Washington, D.C., and this is how the book begins after the prologue. Lincoln leaves Washington, D.C. in late March 1865. He leaves the White House. And he leaves for for about 2 weeks. And it's the longest period of time that he will ever leave the White House. And he goes to the headquarters of Ulysses Grant in City Point, Virginia. My argument is that I believe that he goes to help orchestrate and oversee the end of the Civil War. Not necessarily that all the fighting will be done by the time his trip is over, but that during the trip he will have effectively watched the war end, and that he will have laid down the template, if you will, for what needs to happen for the war to end. Now, notice I've said things like lay down the template. I've talked about a process. Lincoln understood process, that there had to be process by which a war ends, which is different from thinking a moment comes, a discrete moment, and then the war is over. Before that moment, there was war. After that moment, there's peace. Lincoln, as a statesman, as a president, as a thinker, as a leader, understood that in reality, of course, that can't be how things work. After Appomattox, when Lincoln gives what becomes what we now know as his last speech, he never says during that speech, the war is over. He doesn't say it. He could have. He could have used this as a political moment to simply declare the war over. He talks about the great victory. He congratulates the troops. But he talks about what has to happen now. And he also acknowledges basically that the conflict, he never says the conflict is over. And he knows very well when he gives that speech, for example, that there is a major U.S. Army still in the field, commanded by William Tecumseh Sherman, and that there are many other armies too, lesser in size. So that's Lincoln. And so how you get from that president to the president Andrew Johnson about 16 months later, simply declaring the war over by proclamation, that's a story of two presidents, right? And two approaches to war.
Absolutely. Well, and starting with Lincoln, getting into some of the nuances of this, and I think it's important to try to understand the people that are involved in this history. As you discuss in numerous points, Lincoln seemed to have different conceptions about the nation's Confederate opponents, as well as what the priorities were at the end of the war versus other Northern leaders like Richard Henry Dana and William Seward. Would you mind speaking to some of those differences and what they tell us about Lincoln's worldview versus those of others at the time?
Yes. Let me talk about the three people who you've identified: Abraham Lincoln, William Henry Seward, Richard Henry Dana Jr. So our listeners here will know Lincoln. They're likely to know of William Henry Seward. Seward was Lincoln's Secretary of State. They are less likely to know of Richard Henry Dana. So let me just say a few words about Dana. Dana is an important figure in the book for a number of reasons, mostly because right away after Appomattox, he understands and says publicly that this is not the end of war, that much has to happen. And then he gives a very famous speech that gets greatly circulated a couple months after that, in which he uses this phrase. He says, this is Dana, "We must hold the South in a grasp of war until the South effectively looks the way we want it to look. And then there can be peace." In other words, to use U.S. power, hard U.S. power, meaning the army, to mold the southern states, to have state governments and policies that adhere to what they have to be in order for there to be peace. Okay, so Dana is articulating a vision of war with what becomes known as the grasp of war speech, of hard power, using the army and the whole might of the United States, civilian and military, to effectively continue the war. And this is war as politics by other means, the Clausewitzian notion. It's not actually as severe as a Clausewitz notion, but that would certainly be similar in a way. Actually, Dana isn't so radical, but he does believe that there's a process that has to be involved, and that process is going to involve hard power. And the grasp of war idea is a really important idea because it does shape a lot of policy thinking for those in charge, especially of the armed forces. Seward, now working backwards a little bit, Seward's the Secretary of State under Lincoln and under Andrew Johnson. So he has continuity. And I think that continuity is important. Seward, I believe, sees himself carrying forward Lincoln's vision, whatever that vision is, into the Johnson administration. And that's one of the roles he can play by staying close to Johnson, advising Johnson as Johnson goes forward. Seward, I think, well, I would argue, does not have this idea of a hard, grasp of war. He really believes that you should use soft power as much as possible. I'm now using modern terms, and I apologize, but more that you should be working through local channels of connections with local state governments. This is what Lincoln had done to try to build constituencies in the South that will then serve your purposes. And he also is, as an international affairs person, which he must be because he is the Secretary of State, he is more attuned than anyone to what this conflict looks like to allies in Europe. And for that reason, he knows that if the war continues as war, it gets trickier and trickier because it's not supposed to be a war between two nations. The Confederacy is not a nation, says Abraham Lincoln, says William Henry Seward. It's an insurrection. For Seward, then, it's really important because it's an insurrection to get the U.S. out of the war as quickly as possible, reestablish relations with European allies that are normalized by, for example, getting rid of the blockade. That's really important to Seward because the blockade is creating tension with allies because it's damaging trade. So Seward wants to back the U.S. out of the war in this slow way. And to the extent he knows, he's no fool, that there's going to be problems, there's going to be issues to resolve. His line since 1864 has been over and over again, leave it to the courts. He wants, whether it's the Supreme Court or other courts, if there's legal issues on the ground, leave it to the courts and the law. Seward, as a lawyer and international law and just domestic law expert, this is his view, and that this stuff will take time to work out. Let it work out by natural process where the courts will be the process. Lincoln, finally. I've already said Lincoln's general ideas about the Confederacy not being a legitimate nation. I think the point I'll emphasize here and then wrap up my answer, which has gone on a bit long. You began by asking, maybe I'm rephrasing your question, who are the constituencies that Lincoln favors over others? From the beginning of the war, Lincoln has envisioned this insurrection as an insurrection powered by a small minority of very elite, white supremacist, slave-owning hotheads, or at the time they would have been called fire eaters. In other words, a small minority of people who really didn't have a claim to represent the Southern white majority. Therefore, with this in mind, Lincoln believed that the best political strategy here was to convince, cajole, nudge with patronage, whatever it took, the majority of the Southern whites to realize that their interests were not well represented by the Southern elite minority. And that was always Lincoln's vision. And so he believed right to the end of days, I think, that the Southern white common people, majority, not even that common, but just simply the non-super elite, would be the ones that would be his allies, that they would help break away from the majority and sort of grab the reins of power themselves, lead Southern states out of the war, et cetera, et cetera. Notice at no point did I say that Lincoln believed that his best constituency could be the formerly enslaved African Americans of the South, right? So we're dealing with a population of over 4 million people, nearly half, well, a little bit less than nearly half, I should say, of the population of the South. You can imagine now a different president saying, that's my constituency. Through them, I will create an architecture of ending the war. Lincoln adheres to those people, to be sure. He believes that Black soldiers have played a crucial role in ending the war. He wants there to be rights and even limited voting rights for Black men, but he certainly wants rights for all formerly enslaved Black people. But, and this is, if there's a failing of Lincoln or from the present day, it could be that in a different context, right, we understand that if you're looking for loyal Americans in the South during the insurrection, the most loyal Americans in the South during the insurrection were African Americans. They were the ones who were going to be, who already were, loyal to the United States and its cause. Far more than it turns out, of course, the common whites were. Common whites were much more attached to the elite whites than Lincoln realized at the start of the war. I think over time, Lincoln came to realize just how attached they were, how hard it would be to break that bond of race, that is the lower middle class whites adhering to elite whites whose interests they didn't necessarily match up. So had Lincoln lived, always the question, would he have come to understand better that Black Americans in the South were a better source of support and a better source of loyalty? I think so. But he wasn't quite there yet by the time he died.
And of course, that's a major part of this history of this time is the Black Americans who were impacted by the war. But as you show at numerous points in your book, you highlight the reality that the end of the war and the end of slavery were not necessarily linked, and that both were much more nuanced than the traditional historical account would have us believe. You even write at one point that, quote, "The law was one thing. The reality on the ground was another." Would you mind sharing with us some of the circumstances that made ending slavery, both legally and in practice, so challenging?
Sure. I can touch on these subjects, and maybe along the way I'll refer to other works, because this question you've asked is so important, and it has been the subject of superb scholarship, especially over the past, let's say, 30 years or more. But that scholarship continues, and we're still trying to work out the answer to we being historians, all of us historians, or anyone who works on this subject of Reconstruction, is still trying to work out exactly what that looks like, the reality on the ground as compared to the law. I don't want to say that no one thought about that prior to 30 or so years ago. It was very, very much on the mind of W.E.B. Du Bois when he began working on the subject of Black Reconstruction it began in the late 1800s, and then the book that would become Black Reconstruction is finally published in the 1930s. Okay, let me come back to the question. My first book was about the making and the meaning of the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery by constitutional amendment. That is, it put into the Constitution the abolition of slavery and involuntary servitude, except as punishment for crime. There's a clause there which we may or may not talk about, but it does relate, because the fact that that clause is there indicates that what exactly is servitude, what is slavery, can forms of servitude continue despite the existence of this amendment. So even in that amendment, there's sort of hints that this thing, enslavement, or if you want to call it servitude, and those are two different things legally, but whatever they are, that they aren't simply gone by a moment in which the amendment is declared ratified. And it's Seward who does that. Seward declares the amendment ratified in mid-December of 1865. So Appomattox, let's say mid-April 1865. So 8 months later, we have this amendment. That's the abolition of slavery across the United States by law. And if you want to go back a little bit, you could also point to another thing, which I point to just because it's been in the news lately, and it is terrifically important, and that is Juneteenth. And it's been in the news because Juneteenth became a federal holiday just a few years ago. But Juneteenth has been celebrated for well over 150 years. And the holiday is Texas specific. It begins as Texas specific, and it has to do with how emancipation was declared in Texas. The holiday then sort of spreads out, and it becomes this holiday that is used to celebrate the end of slavery in the United States. It's the only holiday that is now a national holiday in which the end of slavery is acknowledged through a federal holiday. A holiday, a constitutional amendment, these are wonderful things. They're really important things. I don't want to speak against them, but we would be mistaken to think that these things somehow indicate that on the ground, that slavery simply disappeared. It simply isn't the case. What does it take to make slavery go away? That question then raises really complicated answers. It obviously takes more than law. It takes force. Going back to Richard Henry Dana, the idea of the grasp of war is a notion that you hold a place in a grasp of war until you achieve what you seek. So in terms of emancipation, what this would mean is using the army in particular, but all methods, that is, let's say, federal judicial power. The Department of Justice is created during Reconstruction, actually very early in Reconstruction, not too long after Lincoln's death, only within a couple of years. So the Department of Justice is created to ensure the end of slavery and the attainment of rights that are supposed to come with the end of slavery for African Americans. So that's a civilian judicial power coupled with the army. And you use these on the ground to effectively police society and allow African Americans to assert their freedom with the help of the United States state authorities, the legal authorities, and their military authorities, the army, that the African Americans work together with the agents of the U.S. government, military and civilian, to ensure that slavery is not practiced. This means policing those who would treat African Americans as slaves. And by policing, I mean arresting. This means ensuring that African Americans aren't simply declared free, but that they have rights to sue, that they have rights of access to land that are equal to any rights to access to land that white people have, so that if they're making money, which they should be paid wages. This is also part of it. They can ultimately use those wages to buy land, that they effectively are equal access economic players and judicial players in terms of being able to sue, and maybe even political players in terms of being able to vote. That was always going to be restricted at that moment of 1865. I don't say always, but at that moment they were thinking about male suffrage. This all has to happen for slavery to really be eradicated. And a number of people understand this at the moment, absolutely understand it at the moment. They understood it right away. The abolitionists understood this. Frederick Douglass understood this. The Black abolitionists understood it before anyone else back in the early 1800s. So now it's just a method. Now you've got the U.S. state that has this kind of size and power to do it. And this is what has to happen. And there was every reason to believe it would happen by 1867. There was. By the end of my book, you could argue, if you put the blinders on to what happens after 1867, Congress has assumed control of Reconstruction. They're saying we are going to use the war powers. They have fully embraced this, the Republicans in Congress. And so it seems like that's where we're headed. It doesn't work out that way, but that's another story. But that's the answer. But I will say, in the book, I set this up in a chapter that I call Juneteenth by contrasting something that happens basically at the same time. There's a sermon given for Abraham Lincoln's death. This is in the summer of 1865. And it's June 1st. And the government of the United States has set aside June 1st as a day of mourning for the churches in particular. For Abraham Lincoln. And so there are sermons, all sorts of sermons given to Lincoln, who was assassinated back in April. And I start by talking about this sermon that takes place in Ohio, southern Ohio, in which the minister, like many ministers of the time, they're saddened by the death of Lincoln, but they also celebrate what Lincoln achieved. And this particular minister declares to his congregation that slavery was put to death and the scroll of universal emancipation registered upon the nation's archives. That's interesting. So this idea that it's been written into law, although it hadn't been yet, but the 13th Amendment had passed Congress and was off to the states for ratification. So in a way, he's anticipating it's going to be written into the nation's archives, its constitution. And he talks about 4 million hands clapping, or 4 million people whose hands are clapping with emancipation. He's talking about 4 million enslaved people. Meanwhile, at that very time, not very far away in northern Kentucky, Mary Wilson, who's an enslaved woman, basically is fighting for her freedom. She has been arrested for being off the grounds of her so-called master. She's supposed to not have left the plantation. Her children are being held by this master and his agents. And she goes to the soldiers nearby and say, this is happening. I'm being treated as a slave on this plantation. My children are being treated as a slave. They've been beaten. They've been whipped. This is after Appomattox, right? And so we have a minister saying that emancipation has been achieved. It's effectively on the books. And then look a little bit southward and you see a situation that looks a lot like slavery. And I would say, if you didn't know about events that had happened, this is the same thing as slavery. So yes, slavery is over, but the eradication of enslavement on the ground, that's a different thing. And that's going to take a long time.
Definitely. And I think, and I know our listeners will probably feel the same way when they read your book, one of the most powerful parts of it, you described, that people were still enslaved, and then some soldiers may come through and proclaim, you're emancipated, you're good. And then the soldiers leave and it goes back to how things were. They go back to being enslaved again. And it really highlights just how what was happening on the ground is always so much more nuanced than the larger picture. Even if you say something, even if you say this is the way things are going to be from now on, the devil's in the details. But then also it highlights the role of the Army in all of this. And of course, the head of the Army at the time, General Ulysses S. Grant, is a major figure in your work. And you take your readers through his shifting priorities and areas of concern post-Appomattox. So, Mike, I was wondering if you would mind sharing how this impacted his response to mustering out troops, particularly when it came to free Black troops versus soldiers who were recently emancipated.
The role of Ulysses Grant throughout my book is a good example, maybe the best example, of how people make certain assumptions about war endings and then have to confront realities on the ground. Grant really wants the war to be over. There's no question he wants the war to be over. And that's important to remember. He's a military leader, right? In other contexts, we might think of a military leader wanting a war to continue just so that they can hold on to power. This is not Ulysses Grant. Ulysses Grant is the most respected, worshipped almost military leader of the United States, not only at the time of Appomattox, but for years to come. And he wants the United States to be at peace. In fact, when he runs for president, 3 years after the surrender at Appomattox, he will make "Let us have peace" be his slogan. So this is a warrior who wants peace. But how do you get there? Grant has to deal with a lot of these realities on the ground and reports that are coming in from the South, from the far West, where he's dealing not only with issues of Confederates, but also issues of Native American conflict that are coming into his inbox, if you will, at the same time. So he, as general-in-chief, ultimately under Johnson, but as lieutenant general of the Army, first under Lincoln, he's dealing with these things. So for Grant, I see him as hoping to muster out the troops as fast as possible. He gives a really important speech, a number of them, but an important speech to the Army in the summer of 1865 when he basically thanks them for their service, indicates that they will be mustered out. And then the mustering out that's going on in the summer of 1865 into the fall and early 1866 is pretty impressive in terms of how you muster out a million-man army. And it's happening quickly. But there are these logistical issues of how you muster out an army. Who is mustered out first? Who do you hold on to among the volunteers? I'm talking about the volunteer army. The regular army is different. The regular army is an army that you hold on to. There would be debates about how big that army would be. And those debates would continue long after the period I'm dealing with, and are really nicely dealt with in Cecily Zander's book about the regular army during the war. It deals other issues too. But I'm talking about the volunteer army. So a lot of the soldiers who are mustered out first are those who have served the longest. That makes sense. But now we come to African American troops, and we're dealing here with a significant body of U.S. troops who are African Americans, well over 160, 170,000 troops. Many of them were free African Americans before the war. Many of them were enslaved African Americans when the war began and would become soldiers in units in the U.S. Army. How do you muster these folks out? And when do you muster them out? And there is a moment in the book, and I think this might be what you're getting at, where there is concern among many about mustering out Black troops, especially those who only recently have been enslaved, mustering them out, especially if you muster them out in the South, where they live, after all. I'm thinking here about the formerly enslaved people who had grown up in these areas. When soldiers are mustered out at that time, they are given the option to buy their weapons. These are U.S. soldiers. This is not true of the Confederate soldiers. They were supposed to stack arms. They could hold on to sidearms usually, but they were supposed to stack arms. The U.S. soldiers given the option to buy their weapon at a good rate. And that's just standard policy. So now it's a fairly easy thing for someone to buy their basic rifle if they, and so now this is what's being considered. Is the U.S. Army really going to release thousands and thousands of Black men armed into the U.S. South? White Southerners in places like southern Louisiana, southeastern Texas, are really concerned about this. And they're writing the government and saying, you can't do this. And Grant and others are listening to these concerns. And they, too, are not entirely sure what happens if these Black people who are armed are released. In fact, the Black people with arms who were to be mustered out, if they wanted guns for self-defense. They understood that they would be up against great pressures from society, violence and so forth. There was no illusion to many of them of how that might work. They wanted guns if they wanted guns for that reason. But the idea that this could become a race war among white people, an insurrection of Black against white, this notion that's informed by memories, even though it's been generations of Haiti, memories that are distorted because things did not play out in Haiti the way the story had been told, things that were going on in Jamaica at the time that were amplified as a race war, when in fact, again, that's not what was happening. All of this is coming into the public dialogue. So Grant issues an order. There's a correspondence that's in the book where he basically tells his inferiors in the army not to allow Black soldiers who muster out to hold on to their arms. That's a differential treatment. That is, white soldiers are to be allowed to hold on to their arms, and the Black soldiers, most of whom in these areas he's talking about are formerly enslaved people, are not. That order goes back and forth, but Grant basically holds the line. And it's a moment where you can really see the race picture entering so clearly into how if you want to call it the post-war world, will play out, even though it's still wartime when all of this is going on. And to focus on Texas then is really where this is most obvious, where it's the area where there were a lot of Black troops who had been sent to Texas for various reasons that have to do with possible conflict with Mexico, occupation duty in Texas. If you muster them out, the white Texans are very worried about this, them being armed. And so that's the reality on the ground. What's in the storybooks, what's in the history books, is Juneteenth. Juneteenth is a holiday in which what is honored is a white U.S. officer, Gordon Granger, standing in Galveston, proclaiming freedom throughout the state, reading the Emancipation Proclamation, reading an order that he has written that has to do with the rights that now attain to freedom. And that's on June 19th, 1865. We're about to have the 160th anniversary of that moment. That's a proclamation. Those are words. Within weeks, Granger has backed off on this. There's no Freedmen's Bureau yet in Texas. and he eventually orders black people to stop gathering around military posts. He says that they should go back to their masters and to live on the land there. They should not be roaming the streets. This is not what freedom is supposed to look like. So that order, that proclamation of Juneteenth, the behind the scenes discussions about whether black people should be armed that I described with Grant, those are different things, and yet they're happening at the same time. One is about proclamation, order, and stated policy, and the other is about the realities on the ground.
Well, and as listeners of this podcast have already seen and will continue to see as we continue our journey through American presidential history, there are some things that continue on, and this idea of white panic is one of those. But also one of the things that you highlight in your work is the impact on Native peoples. And you highlight in the United States post-Appomattox that it was still a nation at war with Native nations in the Great Plains and the West. You write at one point that, quote, the Civil War created opportunities for some natives in the West and catastrophes for others. So, Mike, would you mind sharing a little about how Native peoples impacted the course of the Civil War, and conversely, how the war impacted Native peoples?
Yes, I will speak to the issue, and it's a great question, and I'm really glad you asked it because it allows me to talk about a part of the book that I didn't realize I would be writing when I set out to write the book. And then fairly quickly along the way, I realized, oh, of course I have to write about this. This is the issue of the U.S. conflict with Native American peoples that is going on simultaneously with what we think of as the Civil War, a war between the United States and Confederate insurrectionaries. Also part of this that involves Native Americans are Native Americans who have aligned officially or unofficially with the Confederacy and therefore are enemies of the United States because they are Confederates. There are three theaters, if you will, where I look at, but really there's many more than three. But I had to limit myself to three theaters where Native Americans are involved. Right? So one is in present-day Oklahoma. It wasn't called Oklahoma back then. It was called Indian Territory. One is in the Plains, the Great Plains. There, the Native peoples that are most important are the Sioux in particular, but there are others as well that are allies of the Sioux. But I'll just mention the Sioux here. But there are others as well. And then there's the Southwest, where the crucial Native nation, if you will, is the Navajo. And if I start with Oklahoma, I'll just say quickly, but there's a lot about this in the book. The Native nations in Oklahoma are distinctive. They, early in the war, a number of the tribes there decide, or at least factions within the tribes, but ultimately whole tribes, ally with the Confederacy. This speaks to the idea of opportunity, right? That they saw an opportunity by joining with the Confederacy to get a degree of sovereignty and that is self-rule that they hadn't gotten under the United States, despite the fact that they had been promised a degree of sovereignty as early as the 1820s, even earlier. Under treaty, they basically weren't getting, the U.S. had backed out on a number of those deals. So the Confederacy and agents of the Confederacy start offering deals to the Native peoples in this area, known as Indian Territory. So these are the Cherokee, the Creek, what are called at the time the civilized tribes. And I hate that word, but that is the phrase that's used for them. And I won't go into detail here about why that phrase is used, but it goes back decades as to why that is. And one of the things, just as an example, that is offered to them by the Confederacy is representation in the Confederate Congress, something they never got by the United States. They had promised sovereignty, and what they wanted was, therefore, that some kind of delegates from native nations could actually represent those native nations in policies determined by the United States, because after all, the U.S. was determining policies involving native nations. So the Confederacy offers that. They never deliver on it in a full way. There's a gesture towards delivering it. But that's what I mean by opportunity. That's just one example. I could give others. Opportunity also means something different. Opportunity means that if there's a war going on in the East, and there is a major war, the Civil War between the U.S. and the Confederacy, troops have to be pulled from the West. The U.S. has to bring all the troops it can bring within reason to bear on the fighting that's going on between the East Coast and the Mississippi, with some fighting to the west of the Mississippi. Most of the U.S. Army, this is the regular Army at the time that the war breaks out, is in the West. And they're out in the West, basically policing, surveilling native nations. Once that troop number begins to dwindle in the West as troops are moved to the East, the opportunity now is now I look at the Great Plains, the opportunity now is better than it has been for some time for a tribe like the Sioux to return to the economic, social, cultural practices that they had practiced before this policing by U.S. armed and civilian agents. And that's what begins to happen. They begin expanding their hunting grounds again to what they have once been, ranging well beyond where the U.S. authorities believed they had a right to go. And so this is an opportunity that's presented to them. They also happen to be extraordinarily skilled warriors. And this represents then a threat that the U.S. will have to deal with. Last theater that I mentioned, as I said, there's many, but is in the Southwest. Here you mentioned tragedy. So the Navajo have a long, distinct history, to be sure. During the Civil War, one of the things, even before the war, I should say, the Navajo have been effectively claiming a certain degree of sovereignty over their homelands in the mountains of New Mexico and around the mountains, not just the mountains, and especially in the flatlands near the mountains, which this all becomes important in terms of where things like railroads are going to go. But let me just come back to them. They are not dealing with much resistance from the U.S. Army in terms of asserting their claims. And then in comes a U.S. general, James Carleton. And Carleton arrives in New Mexico territory with an army. They've traveled from California. The reason they've traveled there is to chase out of the region a Confederate army that has invaded New Mexico territory. By the time Carleton's troops have arrived, the Confederate army, for reasons I won't go into here, they've left. They're out of the place. So now Carleton is in New Mexico territory with an army but no enemy. That is, no Confederate enemy. And it's at this point that Carleton and his key lieutenant, Kit Carson, and others decide that they're going to use this army for a project. And this is the project of basically forced removal of Navajo from their homelands to a reservation, that's a generous term for it, in the Bosque Redondo. That's a large area. It's supposed to be beautifully wooded forest. It's not, never was, but Bosque means forest. And so that's how it's imagined. The U.S. Army then is involved in a forced removal of Navajo onto this area and then using the army to keep them there. And it's not just the Navajo, it's also Apache, the Mescalero Apaches. That's actually the first group that's forced here. There's fighting. There are efforts successful eventually to break away by the Navajo. But all of that goes on until 1866. So if the war ends in 1865, what do we call this? This is a U.S. Army in the Southwest that's supposed to be fighting Confederates. That's its mission. Ends up doing something entirely different, a very different kind of mission, a mission that will end up leading to what the Navajo will call the Long Walk, which is a forced migration, and then the policing of these people on a certain area. Is that part of the Civil War? Well, it's happening at the exact time that we think of the war happening, and then it extends beyond Appomattox, obviously. The U.S. troops are there doing it. There's a moment in the book where U.S. troops who signed up to fight the Confederacy, and now they're mustering out, they're not mustering out. The Confederates are surrendering in the East, and the War Department sends a number of these troops to go to New Mexico territory to be part of this endeavor. And many of them desert because they didn't sign up for that war. And they say, well, that's not our war. But of course, the War Department says it's all of a piece. It's you sign up for war, it's war, this is war, that's war. And so the war that's going on in 1866 in New Mexico territory is just in a different place. We then run into these questions. Is this all the same war? These different wars? Good questions. But at the moment of that time, if you are a U.S. volunteer soldier, the question is immediate. You have to decide, is this a war I'm going to fight? And if you say no, you desert, at which point you can be put into prison as a deserter. So these are things happening on the ground involving Native Americans in very meaningful ways with long-term consequences. We don't normally tell these stories when we talk about the end of the Civil War, and yet how can we not, is my point, I guess.
Well, and as our listeners know, in covering the Madison presidency recently and talking about the War of 1812, you also have the Patriot War, you have the Creek War, you have the Second Barbary War, which we tend to label as different conflicts, but as you show in your book, this all kind of rolls together. It's a more complex story than just, this conflict is completely separate from this conflict over here. And it's in order to really understand it. And I think that's something that you do with your work, is that you really show this is part of a larger tapestry. And it's amazing. And I do recommend to our listeners to really dive more into your book to learn more about that. But turning back to this idea of declaring peace, you note at one point that unlike in the modern era, quote, Americans in 1865 were not accustomed to a president declaring peace. However, as you rightfully point out, this practice was as problematic then as it is now. So I was wondering, why did Andrew Johnson ultimately opt to take that approach, and what problems did this cause for his administration?
Thank you for the question, and it may end up leading me to talk a little bit more about more recent history, that is post-45, 1945 history in the U.S. I want to answer the question, I will, but let me just point out that declaring peace is not what Johnson did, and it's not what George W. Bush did in May of 2003. They declared an end of war. This may seem like a semantic difference that really isn't worth talking about. I think it is worth talking about. And I think the presidents understood in this case, whether it's George W. Bush or Andrew Johnson, or we can talk about other presidents. I think if you declare peace, you set yourself up as a president for trouble, obvious trouble, because then it's just a matter of people pointing out violence on the ground and saying, look, there's no peace. How can you declare peace? It's a really big reach to declare peace. I suppose, having said that, there are people who are declaring peace during Reconstruction, including Ulysses Grant at one point. But I think he regrets making such declarations. What Johnson officially does, he does it first in April, saying that there's a cessation of hostilities, that is an end of war, everywhere but Texas. Then August 20th, 1866 is when he says everywhere, Texas too. Now, saying that a war is over is something different. But that, too, is effectively what George W. Bush is doing. He's saying that the combat operations, that war is over. He never says that there's peace in Iraq, not in that speech anyway. So just setting us up if you want to ask me about that. And I will point out that, yes, there have been other moments in recent history where we find presidents doing that. So it may not shock us so much. You go back to the Vietnam War. Senator George Aiken famously and sort of off the cuff is supposed to have said the best way to handle the U.S. withdrawal from Vietnam is to declare victory and get out. He actually didn't say exactly that phrase, but it doesn't matter because the phrase becomes associated with him, and it's a great phrase in sort of how you end a war. Just say you won and walk away, right? And can you do that? Is that allowed? Sure, it's allowed. And I think that commanders do it all the time, and the president's commander-in-chief, they can declare victory and say the war's over. What was Andrew Johnson doing in the declaration in August? That is, this is a presidential proclamation, August 20th, 1866. So there's a very clear political motivation for him to do this. In August of 1866, he is at war, political war, with Congress. Congress has a supermajority of Republicans who are willing and have overridden. They've had the 2/3 majority to override Johnson's vetoes, which he gave back in the spring of some major legislation on Reconstruction, the Civil Rights Act of 66, the Second Freedmen's Bureau Act. So they override the vetoes. They've also passed the resolution and sent to the states for ratification the amendment that would become the 14th Amendment. Johnson is against that amendment. He has campaigned against that amendment. He is campaigning against that amendment at the very time that he issues this end of war proclamation, and the two are absolutely connected. That is President Johnson's, Andrew Johnson's campaign against the 14th Amendment and his issuing of an end of war proclamation. He sees that the Congress is going to come back into session in December. And when they do, they are going to use their power, which they now have a greater power effectively than he does because they can override any veto he gives. And they're going to have power under the 14th Amendment Enforcement Clause. And they're going to use that power using the army, using the military to affect the changes they want and that are articulated in the Civil Rights Act of 66, in the Freedmen's Bureau, in the 14th Amendment. They're going to use that power effectively to, hold the South in a grasp of war, if you will, and to pass legislation. All right, so he's the president. How can he undercut that power? And his answer is many things, but one of which, he's the commander-in-chief, he's the president, so he can declare a cessation of hostilities. He can say the war is over. If he says the war is over, that declaration will stand in contrast to anything Congress does to use the army to affect its changes, because how can you use the army if there's no war? And it's a strategy. It's a strategy of a proclamation to declare the war over, because Congress, to do what it wants and needs to do for Reconstruction, is going to rely on war powers. That's the framework for what Congress is doing. It claims that it continues to have war powers, even though the major armies of the Confederacy have surrendered for some time ago. It has war powers, and it will use these war powers to push forward a Reconstruction agenda. For more on that, you can see the book that came out some years back by Gregory Downs, After Appomattox, a superb book about the way Congress is affecting Reconstruction through the war powers. If a president says, hey, the war's over, that means you have no war powers. That takes away Congress's ability to act. So Congress will then have to come up with ways to deal with that proclamation. And the book's last chapters deal with that fight between Johnson and Congress over that issue. For Congress, by the way, the war isn't over until the last formally seceded state is represented in Congress. Congress says that they have war powers until the Union is back as it was in terms of Southern states having representation in Congress. So Congress defines the war in terms of Congress because that's what Congress does. And that doesn't happen until 1871, early 1871, when they seat the final representatives from the state of Georgia. So again, for Congress, they believe they have war powers well beyond Johnson saying you don't, because the war is over. And that's what he's doing in August of 1866.
Over the past several days, 3 females have been found dead.
Looks like someone's going after these girls.
Then they have to know to watch their backs.
Streaming now.
You wouldn't want what happened if this wouldn't have happened to you.
Exactly why I need to keep going on this.
Starring Emmy Award winner Amanda Seyfried.
I'm worried about what you're gonna find.
So am I.
Long Bright River. A limited series. Streaming now. Only on Peacock.
Well, and as we're wrapping up our conversation, and one of the things our listeners will see when they read your book is that you pose so many fascinating questions that really invite us to consider the nuances. And so at one point in talking about the Joint Committee on Reconstruction, you posed the question of, quote, whether the absence of peace was the same thing as the presence of war. And so, Mike, after all of your research for this work, what did you come to conclude with this? And what do you feel is the key takeaway for readers from your book?
There are 2 takeaways. One is specific to the Civil War, and that is that we rethink the classic temporal boundaries of the Civil War. And with those temporal boundaries, I would also talk about spatial boundaries, so that we always, that this is a process that should never end, that we always be asking, when was the Civil War and where was the Civil War? I suppose other W questions like who was in Civil War, but those 2 questions, the when and the where, are really important to me, that we ask those questions. What's the takeaway? That it's not where and when you might think, I guess. In a larger way, to your issue of that quotation you mentioned about peace and war, the idea that the opposite of war is peace, by this time in our human history, it should be fairly obvious if you think about it, that equation doesn't hold true. Many wars exist, and then they are said to be over. But what lives on in that area where the war is ostensibly over is a lot of unrest, civil unrest, political turmoil, and actual fighting and dying, sometimes with people in uniform of war. Peace is an ideal and a wonderful ideal, and it should never be abandoned. And it's an ideal in international relations. It's an ideal in domestic relations. So if you think about what is it that a police force does in a community or in a state or a federal police force in the nation, their job is to keep the peace. That phrase, keep the peace, is the key, especially when you think about a local police force. Does that mean there will be peace in the community? Of course not. There will always be certain disturbances, but the ideal, the legitimacy of a police force is to keep the peace, is to try to get to that ideal. If you take it to international relations and we think about a phrase, police keeping or policing forces of nations in places like Korea, let's say, in the Korean War, again, the idea here is to strive for peace. But that is not the existence of peace. And it may well be the absence of official war. So what's the takeaway? The takeaway is that peace is an ideal we're striving for. Wars, when they end, usually end for instrumental political reasons, with people in power declaring, making them over, that is, declaring them over or creating agreements by which they can be said to be over for instrumental, that is, self-serving or politically oriented reasons. That is not the same as saying that the place in question is now at peace. It's not even the same as saying that on the ground, the individuals in this area where there is supposed to be an absence of war because the authorities have said there's an absence of war. It is not the case that the individuals inhabiting that space believe that war is over, because on a daily basis, they may be seeing circumstances that to them are no different or very little different from how things were before that moment when the authorities said that war is over. And I think it's really important that we think, as always in history, about not simply policies from the top, let's say the presidents, since this is a podcast about the presidencies. Those policies are absolutely meaningful. I don't mean to take away from what the presidents and the presidencies do, but we also always need to ask what's going on in the ground, and how does what's going on in the ground conform to or differ from what the presidencies, if you want to focus on the U.S., what the presidents are saying is the truth of what's going on the ground. So I think my book deals with that topic quite a bit with the Civil War, where you have presidents saying one thing, or the president's officers, generals, let's say, saying one thing, and then the ground is different. A former Attorney General of the United States, James Speed, writes to a friend in the midst of, let's say, about a year after Appomattox, and he says something that stuck with me and continues to stick with me, that, and this is a very educated lawyer, and he's seen, of course, the whole Civil War, but now where he's a year past the war and trying to figure out, like everyone else, how to bring this to some kind of ending. And he says, I used to think that peace was the natural order of society and war the abnormal. Does history so teach? He asks. He writes in his letter. That is, he now realizes that he may have it backwards, that maybe war is the more common state, and peace is not so common and is more the ideal. And that's what history teaches. And if that's the case, it should then be reflected in policy, whether it's domestic policy, international policy, what have you. How it's reflected, well, that's to be determined. But that would be the larger takeaway, I guess, in answering your question.
Well, and Mike, you have given us in this work so much to ponder. For our listeners, there is so much more. We have just barely scratched the surface of what all is in your work in this conversation, but I hope that for our listeners that this encourages you to pick up the book, which is Lincoln's Peace, The Struggle to End the American Civil War. Mike, thank you so much for joining us on Presidencies. Congratulations on the publication of this amazing book, and just thank you for all the insight that you've provided today.
Well, thank you, Jerry, and I really appreciate the opportunity to come and talk about the book and to be on your show, and I also appreciate your podcast in general. I think it's wonderful that you're doing this about the presidencies, and I think you're going to be very busy in the years to come with many more excellent episodes ahead. I'm sure that you will be having on your show. So thank you, and thank you for letting me be part of the discussion.
Absolutely. And it as I was reading this, it really gets to the heart of what I'm trying to do with presidencies. And so that's why I knew that this would be a great conversation, because it really is all about the nuances, and we can understand what the presidents are saying and trying to achieve, but it's really what's happening on the ground that is so important, and that shines in your work. So thank you so much.
Okay. Well, thank you. Thank you, Jerry.
Special thanks again to Michael Vorenberg for joining me for this insightful conversation on his new book, Lincoln's Peace, The Struggle to End the American Civil War. Be sure to pick up a copy, as there is so much more to learn from it than we had time to cover in our conversation. I'll have a link to the book on the page for this episode on my website, presidenciespodcast.com. On the website, you can find past episodes of the podcast, links to more information on all the American presidents, as well as information about how you, yes, you, dear listener, can help to support the podcast. Thank you so much to all of our patrons, as well as folks who have left ratings and reviews on their podcast app of choice to help folks know why they too should be listening to the Presidencies podcast. Likewise, Thanks so much to everyone who has shared information about the podcast, either on social media or in your offline life with friends, families, and colleagues who love deep dives into history. It truly takes a village to get the word out there. Last, and certainly not least, I thank you for listening. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to reach out via email at presidenciespodcast@gmail.com. You can also connect with me on social media if you're not already. I'm available on Facebook, Blue Sky, and Mastodon as Presidencies, on the formerly known as Twitter at Presidencies89, and on Instagram and Threads as Presidencies Podcast. Until next time, stay safe and healthy, be kind to one another, and take care, dear friends.
Hello everyone, my name is Tom Kearns and I host the Anglo-Saxon England podcast, where I cover the history and culture of England from the departure of the Romans in the 5th century to the Norman conquest in 1066. So far we've surveyed the collapse of Roman rule in Britain, the migration of the Anglo-Saxons, and the history of Northumbria from its beginnings in the mists of legend to its destruction at the hands of Viking raiders in the 9th century. I hope you'll come and give it a go.